Welcome back to The Rustic Wife. I'm Alana. So yesterday my husband and we picked about almost a bushel of green beans, and I was going to can them last night, but I was too tired, so we're going to do them today. We will be pressure canning green beans, and they are a low acid food, so they need to be pressure canned. I'm going to be showing you how it is recommended that you preserve green beans. So along with showing you the steps on how to properly and safely can green beans, I will be showing you some of the safety features on the pressure canner. Some people are really terrified and they're afraid that the lid's going to blow off, and I think in some of the old pressure canners that may have happened. I'd be scared too, but anyway, the new pressure canners, they have more safety features than the old ones. So as long as you inspect your pressure canner and follow all of the rules in your manual that will come with your pressure canner, you will be fine. So what I like to do is I like to lay out all of the tools and the equipment that I need for when I'm going to be pressure canning, or even when I'm hot water bath canning. That way you're not running around opening drawers and slamming cupboards in the last second trying to find everything that you need. You're going to need your green beans. These are stringless, so I didn't have to remove the strings on these. We picked them last night, we washed them, we took the stems off, and then we snapped them into pieces like that. They're not all perfectly uniform, but that doesn't matter. You can also leave them whole. We've done some earlier where we did leave some of them whole, and we cut some of them into pieces. This is a Presto 23-quart pressure canner. Some people say that you cannot can with a pressure canner on a glass top stove, and you can see I have a glass top stove. Check your owner's manual of your stove and see what the weight restriction is for the glass top. Mine is 50 pounds, and apparently all American pressure canners, I believe, are too heavy for a glass top stove. The Presto is not. I've contacted Presto and it's fine. This full is not 50 pounds, so I'm okay here. Here's the lid. We're going to go through that in a bit. I've got my rings and the new lid inserts. You want to use new lids for this every time, because you don't want to go through the trouble of pressure canning, preparing all of your vegetables and pressure canning to have your jars not seal. Also, before you start, you want to check your jars to make sure that there's no chips or cracks, which would cause a weakness in the glass and could cause breakage in the pressure canner. Or if there's a chip up here, that could hinder the seal, so you want to check those out first too. The rest of the jars are actually in my turkey roaster. I filled them with water and they're on low, keeping warm. You don't have to use a turkey roaster if maybe you don't have one. You can just keep your jars warm in the actual canning pot while you're filling the jars, and just take one out at a time. Our jars will be filled with beans and then boiling water. So I have my kettle here that has been boiled. I also have the rest of the tools that I'm going to need. I have a jar funnel, very handy, just a little scoop to fill the beans. I've got a wooden chopstick. Use anything non-metallic. You're going to need a tool to debubble, get all the air bubbles out of your jar after you've filled it up with the hot water. I have some pickling salt. You don't have to add salt to your beans if you don't want, but I add it for a little bit of flavor, and also it helps retain the color. I also have a bit of white distilled vinegar that I'm going to put a couple tablespoons into the water of the canner, because if you have hard water, that helps to keep that white residue off your jars. I also have a cloth to wipe the rims clean after I've filled the jars. That's also another reason why your jars may not seal. If you have debris on the top of the lid, then that will hinder the seal too. I also have my jar lifter to put the jars in and out of the canner. I also have a tea towel for when the jars are finished being processed. I can put the hot jars on top of the tea towel on the counter. You don't want to put hot jars onto a cold counter because the jars may crack. My pressure canner manual, that is like a Bible. Don't ever throw one of these away. It tells you so much. It tells you step by step how to use your pressure canner. It tells you safety features. It gives you phone numbers and addresses to contact the company if you need parts for it, so don't ever lose that. I should also mention that the jars should be washed, obviously, but you don't have to sterilize them because they will be basically sterilized in the pressure canner. So I will be time stamping these as well if you are already familiar with pressure canning and you want to skip this, but if you aren't, these steps and safety tips are pretty handy to know. Just if you think I'm flapping away a lot, you can fast forward to those. But your pressure canner will actually require water inside. It's not like a hot water bath canner where your jars are going to be covered with water. In the hot water bath canner, you're going to be covering your jars with at least 1 to 2 inches of water. Your manual will tell you how much water that you need to put into your pressure canner. So I have put 12 cups of water there. I'm keeping it warm. You don't want to put too little, and you don't want to run your pressure canner ever out of water. So you don't want this boiling away waiting for you to fill the canner, because that's going to evaporate a lot of your water in your canner body. You just want to kind of keep it warm. But regardless of how many jars you put in here, you will only ever add how much your manual requires. So I'm going to go through the components of my pressure canner anyway. Most of them are pretty much basically the same. They might look just a little different, but I'm just going to go through some of the safety features that they have. So this is the pressure canner body. You can see inside it's got a rack on the bottom. I'll show you. I ordered an extra one so I could put 2 layers of jars. The quality of the metal is not great, but you need a canning rack. So you're at the bottom so your jars don't sit right on direct heat. You see this little V right here? So once I show you the lid, you'll understand what that means. So I'll show you the lid first. So this is the lid for the pressure canner body, and we're going to go through all of the components of it, and I'll tell you what each one does and go through some of the safety features. So the first thing is the pressure gauge. This tells you how much pressure is built up in the pressure canner, and it's measured in pounds per square inch, or PSI. This dial gauge needs to be calibrated each year. That's the only thing with these pressure dial gauges, is that you need to send them somewhere to have them calibrated. If it's off by a pound or two, you run the risk of your food being underprocessed, and since we're dealing with low acid food, you run the risk of botulism, and that is not something you want to mess around with. So in the United States, I believe you can send your pressure regulator to your local county extension office, and they can have it calibrated for you. We don't have those here in Canada, or not that I know of, but you can send it back to the company where you bought your pressure canner, in my case Presto. They will calibrate it for you and send it back. So that has to be done yearly in order to ensure shelf-stable, safe food. The next thing we have is the vent pipe. This is the primary pressure relief valve for this canner that helps ensure that your canner does not build up pressure in excess of 15 pounds. Now this pressure regulator will sit right on top of the vent pipe, and with this particular pressure regulator you need to use the dial gauge. This is also a safety feature because this also helps ensure that your canner will not build pressure in excess of 15 pounds. Next we have the air vent cover lock that moves up and down, and this also exhausts air out of the pressure canner, but once this is up, that indicates that your pressure canner is full of pressure. Once that is up, you never want to take the lid off of this pressure canner. That is a visual indicator that there is pressure in your pot. Over here, this little rubber button here, that is called the overpressure plug. In the event that your air vent is blocked and no air can escape, instead of blowing the lid off, this little rubber button here will actually pop out and exhaust the air for you. So that is another safety feature. This is the underside of the lid. So next we have the rubber sealing ring. So that fits just right around there, and that's responsible for creating a pressure tight seal between the lid and the canning body. So you want to make sure it's not dry or cracked, because if it is, that will hinder the seal between the lid and the canning body, and your canning pot may not build pressure if that happens. So I always have one of these on hand just in case I'm in the middle of canning season and something happens to it. If you have to wait for it to be delivered, it could be like 2 or 3 weeks. Next here is that's the overpressure plug we talked about. When you order your sealing ring, you automatically get one of these because you have to make sure that this overpressure plug is also supple. It's rubber as well, and you don't want that to be dry and cracked. This is the underside of your vent pipe, and when you start canning, you want to always look through that hole to make sure it's not clogged with any sort of debris. You want to be able to see daylight through that. If it is, you want to get maybe a brush and brush away any of the debris, or a very thin pipe cleaner or something that's going to clean that hole, and you'll be able to see through it. Also, if you hold the lid a certain way, you can actually see light through the holes right there as well. It's hard to see through here, but you want to make sure all of the holes on the underside of the vent pipe are clear. This is the vent lock right here. You have to be very careful holding this lid because you don't want to slam it down and hit the pressure gauge. And that is the bottom part of the vent lock. You can actually unscrew the bottom part. This is the bottom of it, but there's a little rubber seal that goes on there. Again, you want to make sure that it's not dry and it's not cracked, because it could cause condensation seepage, or it just could cause your pressure canner to not build up pressure. So you want to check those parts each and every time you're going to pressure can to ensure everything is in working order. So you don't want to have it so hard on there that you can't get it off, and you don't want it loose that it's going to allow excess condensation and water to flow out of there. So you want that to be able to move up and down freely. So over here, this is called the locking bracket. That's located on the canner body, and that works in conjunction with your air vent lock, and that helps to ensure that the lid cannot be removed from the canner body when there is pressure in the pot. So that is another safety feature. I just want to talk about how the pressure canner actually works. After the canner is sealed with that rubber gasket that I'd mentioned, it becomes a chamber to trap steam that is generated when the water in your canner body is heated to the boiling point. And then when that steam builds, the pressure is increased and it drives the boiling water past the point of 212 degrees, making that temperature inside the canner safe to process low acid foods. So when you're in an area of higher elevation, the atmospheric pressure is lower, so you're going to need higher pressure to process your food safely. So that brings us to how the pressure is regulated in your canner, and it's through these regulators. So this is the regulator that comes with the canner, and this is actually considered a 15-pound weight. As I'd mentioned before, this is a Presto pressure canner, and it comes with the dial gauge and the pressure regulator. Because of where I live, my elevation is I'm below 1,000 feet above sea level. So that means I'm going to pressure can my food at 11 pounds of pressure. I have to rely on this dial gauge right here. So when I'm pressure canning, I have to wait until the canner is under pressure at 11 psi, which is pounds per square inch, and I have to use the dial on my stovetop to regulate the heat to make sure that it stays at 11 pounds. Now, if I happen to let this canner go above 11 pounds all the way up to 15 pounds of pressure, and 15 pounds of pressure is what these canners are made to withstand. If you go a little bit over, it's not going to explode or anything, but anyway, they're made to withstand 15 pounds of pressure. If I do go above 11 pounds and it gets to 15 pounds, this regulator will start to rock, which is a safety feature because it will start to allow excess steam to escape via the rocking motion of this regulator. Now, I mentioned this one came with a pressure canner, but this is called a weighted gauge pressure regulator, and I ordered that separately, and that has been great. So this does not have to be calibrated. This base piece is equivalent to 5 pounds, and the next weight is 5 pounds, and the next weight is 5 pounds, for a total of 15 pounds. Now, This alone here, the 5 pounds, that 5 pounds is not really used anymore for pressure canning unless you are canning high acid foods such as fruit. But I don't know why you would pressure can fruit, because it would kind of become mushy, I would imagine. And you can just water bath can it. Because of my elevation, using the dial gauge, I need to use 11 pounds of pressure to safely process my food. I would use this weight right here. So that equals to 10 pounds of pressure. Now you might be wondering why the dial gauge is 11 pounds and using a weighted gauge is 10 pounds. It's because actually this is really 10.5 pounds. So because they don't make the 1 pound weights for it, they just use that one weight and call that 10. A half a pound is too hard to see on the dial, so they just round that number up to 11. So using the dial gauge, it's 11 pounds of pressure, and using the weighted gauge, it's 10 pounds of pressure. When you look at most recipes, they're usually based off the elevation of 0 to 1,000 feet above sea level. So definitely check your elevation to see where you fall in that category. If you are 1,001 feet above sea level, then you would go to an extra 5 pound weight, which would give you 15 pounds. There are charts online you can look to see what your PSI will be for your elevation, or a lot of times you will have a chart in the book that your canner came with. This regulator is for the Presto canner. Check with the canner that you have to see if you have something equivalent to this. So how this regulator works is after you have vented your canner for 10 minutes to exhaust all the air that's in there, and you add your regulator. So once that regulator, ignoring this one, once this regulator starts to rock, that means it's at the required pressure according to the weight that you have on your vent pipe. So when pressure builds up that's equal to the weight of your regulator, the steam will start to escape, and the pressure inside the canner is managed by the regulator rocking back and forth continuously, allowing that steam to escape, keeping the pressure at the required level inside the canner and not allowing more pressure to build up. So as this rocks back and forth, that is allowing excess steam to escape and excess pressure. Now, if this starts rocking really, really quickly, we know that pressure has built up a little bit too much, so we need to just reduce the heat on our stovetop. And if this is rocking too slowly or stops at all, that means that we have to turn the heat up a little bit just until it's at a nice continuous jiggle. Another word for this, people call them jigglers too. So now we're going to actually get into canning. So I've just taken a couple of jars out of the turkey roaster right now because I want them to stay warm, but I'm just going to add some salt to my jars of beans. Again, you don't have to add salt, this is just our preference, but it does help retain the color. And if you are going to use salt, make sure you use something that doesn't have an anti-caking agent in it. Any sort of preservative could cause your brine to be cloudy, so I'm using pickling salt. In the book, my canning book, which came with the canner, it said half a teaspoon of salt per pint and 1 teaspoon per quart, but I'm just doing a 1/4 teaspoon per pint. And then I just fill the jar up to 1-inch headspace. I just usually take my towel and put it over top and shake them down to settle them a little bit. Fill this with boiling water up to the 1-inch headspace as well. You're going to take the non-metallic tool. What you want to do is you want to debubble, and then you want to readjust your liquid up to the 1-inch headspace. You take your clean cloth and wipe the rim. You don't want any little bits of bean on there that could hinder your seal. And then you take your lid and the screw band and do it finger tight. If you do it too loose, then your lid's gonna come off and the contents of your jar will go into your canner. If you do it too tight, the pressure in the canner could create a buckle in the inner lid right there. So you just want to do it finger tight. And you take your lifter and put this into the canner. So I forgot to mention what I'm doing is called raw pack. So that means that the beans that I'm putting into the jar, they're raw. You can also do something called hot pack, and that means that you take your cut up or your prepared beans, however you want them cut up or left whole, and you will put them into boiling water for 5 minutes and then pack the hot beans into the jar. The hot pack also helps take some of the air out of the jar, and sometimes when people have liquid loss, they say that there's too much air in a raw vegetable or raw fruit, and the hot packing eliminates that. But I don't have a problem, so I like to do the raw pack. So that's what this is. When you're filling your jar, you also want to make sure that your beans are fairly snug in there. Not super jam-packed, but quite snug. You want to make sure that you do leave the proper amount of headspace there. Too little headspace and your beans are going to expand during the pressure canning process and could push the liquid out of the jar. And too little, and like I said, your beans will shrink later on and drop the liquid in your jar, and you want to make sure there's about at least half the liquid for it to be shelf stable. Also, it's okay if the jars touch in the canner as well, because you want to pack them in fairly snug so that you can get the maximum amount of jars into your canner. So I have the bottom row packed in there. You can see the sides, the jars are touching, but I can't fit another one beside that. It would be way too tight. So again, it's okay if they're touching, but just not super crammed in there. So you can stack your jars, not quarts, but pints and half pints you can. So I have one of these racks on the bottom again, my jars, this one, and then I'll put another layer of jars on top. Also, when you're doing a second stack, try to put the jars, because you can kind of see down through those holes, try to put the jars not on top of each other, but try to stagger them a little bit. So maybe over there, and then the other one can kind of go right there, so that there's a bit of airflow. So I've got all my jars in the canner. We're going to put the lid on, but again, I like to double check to make sure there's no debris in that vent pipe. I like to see daylight through that for sure. Okay, so earlier in the video, I pointed out this little V on the handle here. You see that little V right there? It says closed, open, it's got arrows. So you want to line that V up with the one on the handle to close the lid and lock it into place. So I'm going to line up that V. You're going to kind of push down so that this seal seats onto the top of the canner. These two handles will make sure that they're lined up and the lid is locked into place. We're going to turn up your stove top to a fairly high setting. We want this water that's in here to start to boil, and then it's going to exhaust some of the air out of this pot through this vent pipe. Now, because of where my microwave is situated above my stove top, I've got my pot positioned in a way that this vent pipe is not underneath the microwave, because we need to watch air vent out of this vent pipe from the pot for about 10 minutes, and I don't want it venting underneath the microwave. Also, our air vent cover lock here is not right underneath the microwave as well, and our overpressure plug is right here. So if ever there was a situation where my pot got full of pressure in excess of 15 pounds, which is too much for my area, this plug is going to blast out, and it's going to blast out steam over there. It's not going to blast out steam underneath the microwave. Now, the only problem with this is preferably I would have that vent plug over there on the other side, so I could actually come in case of emergency and shut that stovetop off to get the heat away from this. But what I can do, if there is an emergency and that overpressure plug blows, I can run downstairs and shut the breaker off to the kitchen here. So before you start pressure canning, just maybe make sure you know how to shut the breaker off to your appliances in your kitchen. That way I don't have to reach back here, shut off the stove, and risk a potential scalding if that is going to blow out. I'm going to allow this to come up to temperature, and as soon as we see a steady stream of steam coming out of that vent, we are going to set a timer for 10 minutes, and once that is exhausted for 10 minutes, then we're going to add our weighted regulator. Now you may see that overpressure plug moving up and down slightly. It's also exhausting a little bit of air from the pot as well. It hasn't quite sealed yet, so it is normal to see it kind of moving up and down a little bit. Also, it will be normal to see a little bit of condensation at the start of the processing time coming out from around there. Also bubbling out from around the vent pipe, and you will also see some bubbling out from around the air vent cover lock. That's at the start of the processing time. And you can see some water sputtering out of that vent pipe. That's also normal. It's just exhausting right now. And it's important to exhaust your canning pot for the full 10 minutes. Otherwise, you may not get the proper temperature in your pot for canning, and then that could cause your food to be underprocessed. Okay, you can't really see it. I can see it if I look this way, but I do have a steady stream of steam that is venting out of that vent pipe from my canner, so I'm going to set my timer for 10 minutes. And you can see some condensation and water spitting out of the air vent cover lock. That's also normal. If it happens throughout the entire canning session, then you need to check your gaskets and rings. So I've got 2 minutes left for this to vent. If that cover lock pops up, you still have to continue venting your pot for another 2 minutes. Looks like it's ready, so that's telling me that this pot is under pressure. We'll just continue with venting the pot for the full 10 minutes, even if that lock, so that lock has lifted up. That's okay, so you just continue venting for 2 more minutes. Okay, because I am done my full 10 minutes, you want to put the weighted pressure regulator on top of the air vent, and once that starts rocking back and forth, we'll know that it is up to 10 pounds of pressure. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn this down to about number 5, because I don't want it to have too much pressure build up in there. So because I'm using this weighted pressure regulator, I do not use that gauge. That will not be accurate. I need to rely on this. If I was just using the pressure regulator that came with the pot, I would rely on this gauge. So you see there's a bit of water coming out from the vent pipe. Again, that's normal. When I'm venting my pot, I don't like to have it too high. Start it off at about number 6, and then I gradually start to bring it down a little bit. I don't want to drastically change the temperature so that it's not going to build pressure, but I just don't want it to build too much pressure. So I'm just going to put that down to number 4. Eventually I'll have it down to about a simmer, maybe about a number 2, and you'll be able to tell if that's rocking too quickly. Then you can just adjust your temperature. Okay, the pressure regulator is just starting to move a little bit. Even though that this says it's at the correct pressure, disregard this. This is what you're using right here. You're using this weighted pressure regulator. There we go. It's starting to jiggle. So I'm going to set my timer because there is the correct amount of pressure in my pot for processing. So 20 minutes for pints, and if I was doing quarts, it would be 25 minutes at 11 pounds of pressure. Now 11 pounds of pressure is using this pressure gauge. It's 10 pounds using this regulator. We're going to put this down to in between simmer and number 2. That's why we want to gradually bring that temperature down, because you don't want a really quick fluctuation of temperature within your pot. So when you're pressure canning, make sure you give yourself time. You don't want to be doing 100 other things while you're trying to do this. You want to make sure that your equipment is sound. You've got everything all laid out. You don't want to be rushing around and cause an accident, because that could happen. And never leave the kitchen when this is on the stovetop. You do not want to forget that it's there and build up pressure, and you'll have an awful mess, or potentially someone could get hurt. So make sure, and don't have little kids running around here at your feet either, because you do not want anybody to get steam burn or anything knocked over on them. Also, if that weighted pressure regulator stops rocking, that means that the inside pressure of your pot has dipped below 10 pounds of pressure. If you're using the dial gauge and it dips below 11 pounds of pressure, that means, again, same thing, that there's not enough pressure to properly process your food. So you have to stop your timer, get the pot up to the proper pressure, and start that timer all over again. Even if you only have 5 minutes left, it means that it's not being processed safely and your food could be compromised. So my timer's gone off. That means my processing time is done. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shut the stove top off and let that sit for a couple minutes. Don't ever take that off, and don't ever take the lid off when that air vent cover lock is up. So we're just going to let this sit for about 5 minutes on the heat, and then I'm going to move it over to a cold element on the stove. Okay, so it's been about 5 minutes, and I'm going to very carefully move this pot over to the cold element. So this pot is going to stay on this cold element until there is no more pressure in the pot. My pot usually takes about 45 minutes, but yours may take longer. And don't ever try to speed up the process by putting it under cold water. Believe it or not, people used to do that. That's very, very dangerous. So if you're using a dial gauge and the needles is at 0 and that air vent cover lock is still up, do not attempt to open this lid. So when that air vent cover lock is down, that means that there's no more pressure in the pot and it's safe to open up the lid. And when that time comes, I'm going to show you how to do that so that there's no liquid loss in your jars with too much of a temperature fluctuation too quickly. If you're using the dial gauge, it's actually at 0, but the air vent cover lock is still up. So that does not mean you can open this lid. That lock is up. Oh, it scared me. So since that air vent cover lock just dropped down, that means there's no more pressure, but it will still be really, really hot. And we don't want to take this lid off right now because that's going to be a huge, huge fluctuation in temperature because the temperature inside the pot is still extremely, extremely hot compared to outside in the kitchen here. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to take this regulator off. Be very careful because that's hot. Don't touch that. So we're just going to leave that and let that sit for about 10 minutes. Okay, next, again, this is very hot, so I have oven mitts because what we're going to do is we're just going to crack this lid. Remember these two pieces, how we had to line them up when we put the lid on? So we're just going to turn it counterclockwise, just enough to crack the lid and break the seal. There, I'm just going to lift it up just a little bit. Okay, we're just going to leave it like that for another 10 minutes, we'll say. So sometimes when people are pressure canning, they have complaints of liquid loss in their jars. And that could happen for a couple of reasons, and one of them has to do with taking your jars out of the canner too quickly because the rapid temperature drop or drop in air pressure, it will cause the liquid to siphon out of the jars. So they'll just bubble right out and possibly break the seal and you'll have liquid loss. So that's why I'm doing this in a lot of steps, just to slowly bring down the temperature instead of like a real slap in the face to the jars in there if I just take the lid right off. Plus there's going to be a lot of steam and I don't want to give my arm steam burn. Now I'm going to take the lid half off and then eventually we'll take it right off and remove the jars. So you can see I've got the lid like that and they're actually starting to seal. I can hear the lids popping in there with this temperature change already. Once the processing time is done, some people leave their jars in the canner overnight or for hours to naturally cool down without taking the lid off. That's actually not recommended because it could cause something called flat sour. Flat sour is It spoils the food in the jar. You can't see it until you open the jar, and it tastes sour. And that's the sour part of flat sour. And the flat part is it's caused by heat-resistant bacteria that is not killed during the processing time, and it does not cause gases. It's a thermophilic organism, and it doesn't cause gases, so there will be no expanding in the jar or blowing the lid off or anything like that. It's just flat, so that's why I call it flat sour. And the reason why this can happen is cooling down the food in your jars way too slowly, or using produce that isn't completely fresh. There might have been some spoilage in the produce before. Also, cleanliness is key too when you're canning. Okay, I'm going to take the lid right off. Again, watch the steam. Tilt the lid this way. There's a bit of water there. So I'm just going to put it over here on a cooling rack because it'll be very hot underneath. Okay, I'm going to take the jars out one at a time. I've moved this over here closer to me, and I'm going to put them onto the counter on top of a tea towel. Don't let the jars touch when they're on the counter. You want to have some airflow. You can even put them on a cooling rack on the counter. If you happen to have water on top of the lid, don't tilt that off. It'll evaporate. Just leave it. If you tilt it and it hasn't sealed yet, you could potentially hinder the seal or break the seal. So I accidentally deleted some of the footage that I had previously taken. So the last thing I did was I was taking the jars of beans out of the canner. You want to do that slowly and place them on the tea towel we put on the counter. So you want to leave those jars, you don't want to touch them, leave them for about 12 to 24 hours. Don't tighten the rings, don't tip them, just leave them. In the morning or however long you're going to leave them, check to see if they've sealed. If they have not sealed, then put them in the refrigerator and use them within a week. If you see that they've all sealed, you want to wash your jars. Don't submerge them in water. I just use running water and a cloth, and then label them and place them on your pantry shelves. And you want to leave the outer ring off. And the reason for that is because if one of them has not actually properly sealed and you have the ring tightened on your jar, that could cause a false seal if it was to let go, and you may have spoiled contents in your jar and not know it. So here I am down my basement. I've got all of my beans put away. So you can see right here, I'd mentioned earlier in the video, you can see some of the liquid loss there. That's okay. As long as you have at least half of the liquid in the jar, then you're safe. But you will lose some of the liquid with siphoning or just the shrinkage of the vegetable. So there you go. That was the entire process to create shelf-stable food for yourself safely at home. And I know it was a long one, but I tried to add in all the steps that I thought were important. And I am glad you came along with me today. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you again next time.